in the quiet rural outskirts of Millbrook, Kentucky. 1847 was a year marked by an unusual rise in travel along the old trade route that wound its way through the Appalachian foothills. Nestled between overgrown willows and weather-beaten fencing, stood the Millbrook Inn, a quaint two-story wooden building that seemed to offer a rare promise of warmth to all who passed. At its heart were the Cunningham Sisters, Eliza and Margaret, two women in their early 30s, who had inherited the inn after the tragic death of their parents in a house fire 5 years prior. With their genteel manners, soft Southern accents, and ever-present smiles, they were considered angels of hospitality, celebrated by passing preachers, farmers, and traveling salesmen alike. The sisters welcomed guests with open arms always, offering homemade pies, cooling on the windowsill, fresh linen sheets, and a peculiar kind of attention that bordered on maternal devotion. They were deeply invested in the stories of their guests, listening intently by firelight, asking questions that seemed more curious than courteous. It was said that Eliza had a gift for remembering every detail, from the names of lost children to the color of a wife's eyes. And Margaret could sing old Celtic lullabies that lulled even the most anxious travelers into peaceful dreams. Their love for their guests became something of a legend. Many who stayed at Millbrook Inn wrote of the sisters in letters home, describing them as the purest expression of feminine grace and affection. Far removed from the cold, transactional nature of other roadside accommodations, word of mouth spread quickly across the trade roads, and soon the inn was seldom empty. Despite their hospitality, the Cunninghams remained curiously single, though not for lack of attention. Several suitors had attempted courtship, often returning from the inn with dreamy tales of Eliza's storytelling or Margaret's delicate fingers brushing their arms as she poured tea, but none ever succeeded in forming anything lasting. Didn't return to town at all. Their absence was always attributed to the dangers of the road or the call of opportunity farther west. People rarely questioned it, as the world was still vast and unpredictable in 1847. Letters took months or years, if they arrived at all. What made the Millbrook Inn so intoxicating to travelers wasn't merely the hospitality, but the emotional balm it offered to men hardened by life's cruelty. Many arrived burdened with grief, loneliness, or guilt, and the sisters seemed to know precisely how to ease these wounds. Their affection was subtle, yet magnetic. Margaret might press a warm hand against a guest's cheek during a fevered night, while Eliza would sit by the bed reading aloud until the man wept silently. The inn became a shrine for broken souls, a place where burdens could be shed in the comfort of whispered lullabies and cinnamon-spiced air. People began to speak of the place as if it existed on the edge of the real world, where time slowed, and wounds healed over the years. Those who returned told of changes they noticed. Guests no longer talked as much about the food or the firelight, but about a strange softness in the air, a sensation of being watched by something both benevolent and hungry. Children who wandered into the surrounding woods spoke of hearing songs carried on the wind, voices calling them by name. A few uneasy travelers mentioned feeling too relaxed, as if their bodies resisted the urge to leave the inn after even one night's rest. Some never made it home. The sisters always provided plausible stories. A man had chosen to head south and start anew. Another had fallen ill and died peacefully in the upstairs room, respectfully buried in the churchyard by the reverend who had been summoned. But church records lacked any such entries, and the reverend himself was rarely seen at the inn. It was the discovery of a satchel belonging to a young Irish tradesman named Declan Byrne that first stirred the embers of doubt. He had written frequently to his fiancée, back in Cincinnati, describing in loving detail the kindness of the Cunningham sisters and the strange beauty of their inn. When the letters abruptly stopped, she traveled to Millbrook to find answers. The sisters greeted her with the same warmth as they did all guests, expressing heartfelt sorrow and suggesting Declan must have moved on. But the young woman, suspicious of their vague tone and unnerving serenity, stayed only one night before fleeing with her suspicions intact. She alerted local authorities, but in a county plagued by more pressing matters, known crop failures and political unrest, no investigation was ever formally opened. The community's willingness to accept the sisters' charm was a reflection of the era's desperate need for comfort. Many travelers, especially men without families, desired nothing more than a final resting place where someone would remember them, miss them, and bury them with care. The Cunningham Sisters offered all of this, wrapped in lace doilies and lavender-scented linen. They didn't just provide a place to sleep, they gave a fantasy of maternal safety, of being wanted and understood. And yet, there was something disquieting about the degree of attachment they showed. Guests were never forgotten. Their stories always repeated with unshakable clarity. Their names inscribed in memory with reverent care. As years passed, a subtle shift occurred in how locals spoke of the inn. It became folklore, a place of curious magic where one might disappear not out of malice, but because they found something they couldn't bear to leave. Some speculated that the sisters had lost more than just parents in that house fire years ago, that the flames had taken something essential and replaced it with a void they tried to fill with the affection of strangers. Others believed they were simply lonely women who had discovered a way to ensure no one ever abandoned them. Whatever the cause, the truth behind their love remained as carefully hidden as the root cellar beneath the house. A place never shown to guests, always locked, always humming with a faint floral scent that never quite matched the seasons above. The transformation of the Millbrook Inn from a place of comfort into a setting for whispered horror began slowly, almost imperceptibly. It started with vanishing faces, stories that didn't quite align, and a subtle sense of unease that trailed those who returned from a visit there. While Eliza and Margaret Cunningham maintained their glowing reputation among the locals, those who stayed more than a single night often left looking change-distant, pale, sometimes murmuring incoherently about strange dreams and voices that echoed through the halls after midnight. Some never left at all. By 1851, a handful of concerned townsfolk began to keep quiet tallies of names they'd heard associated with the inn. Merchants, salesmen, wandersmen mostly, unattached, or at least unmissed. The more often their names were mentioned, the more obvious it became that they had ceased to reappear in town or write letters home. Patterns emerged for those willing to look, but few dared to question the sisters openly, afraid of disrupting the fragile calm of a town that depended on travelers and the warm myth of the Cunninghams' hospitality. Then came the heavy spring. Rains of 1852. The hillside behind the inn, where Margaret often tended a wildflower garden, gave way during a minor landslide. What washed down wasn't just mud and roots, but a glimpse of something far more grotesque: fragments of bone, pieces of fabric, and a cracked belt buckle engraved with the initials DB. Local authorities were forced to take action, though their intrusion was half-hearted, marred by disbelief and a reluctance to accuse two women so beloved and respected. Eliza greeted them as she always did, with a warm smile, a gentle voice, and fresh pies cooling on the window ledge. She claimed the remains belonged to an old livestock burial site, a lie delivered with such serenity that some of the search party believed her outright, but the landslide had spoken too clearly. Further digging around the property revealed a horrific secret: 43 unmarked graves scattered beneath the garden, near the root cellar, and even inside the stone wall foundation. Of the inn itself, the graves were shallow, rushed, and at times layered, more than one body occupying the same pit. Most had decomposed to little more than bone, their clothes reduced to brittle rags, yet a few had enough remaining flesh to suggest they hadn't been dead long.
How many?
Clutched rosaries, wedding rings, or pocket watches.
Oh.
One held a worn letter, never sent, addressed to a mother in Ohio. The sheer number of remains stunned the community. The Cunninghams were immediately taken into custody, their expressions unreadable even as the crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office to catch a glimpse of the two women who had once been the town's darlings. The sisters said little during questioning. Liza refused to speak altogether, staring into a dark corner of the room as if something were whispering only to her. Margaret offered only fragments of sentences, mentions of mercy, of salvation, of how guests had wanted to stay, had begged for peace and rest. What emerged from the investigation was a story difficult to comprehend, even by the standards of a country still haunted by frontier violence and Civil War scars. While there was no concrete evidence of torture or overt brutality, the deaths bore an eerie consistency. Most of the bones showed no signs of struggle or trauma. Instead, the victims appeared to have been gently sedated, perhaps with laudanum, or herbs, then quietly smothered, or allowed to fade from life with minimal resistance. There were signs of rituals: flowers placed on chests, bodies aligned in specific directions, and hands folded neatly, almost lovingly. It wasn't murder in the traditional sense, something colder and more ritualistic, a final act of control disguised as tenderness. Speculation ran rampant. Some believed the sisters were suffering from an inherited madness, a psychological condition brought on by the trauma of their parents' death in the house fire. Others were convinced they had become witches, using arcane methods to trap the souls of men in eternal servitude. Religious leaders preached that the sisters had fallen to demonic possession, while more pragmatic townsfolk whispered that it was simply loneliness, that the inn had become a mausoleum for affection-starved strangers who mistook false warmth for salvation. Regardless of the motive, the facts remained chilling. The sisters had welcomed strangers with open arms, listened to their pain, fed them, comforted them, then ensured they would never leave. When townspeople searched the inn further, they discovered hidden compartments beneath the floorboards. Inside were small keepsakes, locks of hair, letters, trinkets from the victims. These were organized meticulously, as though the sisters had been curating a museum of the dead. Most disturbing of all was a hand-bound journal found beneath a false panel in Eliza's room.
Ow.
The pages were filled with flowing script detailing not just names and dates, but emotions, how each guest made her feel, what they cried about, how deeply they slept, and whether they earned their rest. The journal did not read like a killer's log, but rather a devotional diary, an unsettling blend of love and control that made it difficult to parse whether the acts were driven by empathy or something far more predatory. Following the discovery, the town quickly distanced itself from the Cunninghams, fearful of what the truth might do to their reputation and economy. Many locals destroyed letters and records connecting them to the inn, while others insisted they had always suspected something strange. The sheriff who led the investigation eventually resigned, unable to reconcile the women he once considered family friends with the evidence of their actions. The inn was boarded up, the land salted by those who believed in curses, and the story buried under layers of shame and silence. Yet the graves remained, 43 of them, some with names, most without. No family ever claimed the bodies. Their identities remained lost to time, save for the artifacts uncovered with them, silent echoes of journeys that ended in a place where love was given freely and then taken forever. The attic of the Millbrook Inn had long been regarded as off-limits to guests. A narrow creaking staircase led up to a padlocked door at the end of a dark corridor, where the scent of lavender mingled with something older, fainter, and metallic. Few visitors ever questioned the restriction, as the rest of the inn was so generously open and comforting. But after the discovery of the 43 graves, the attic became the final piece in a puzzle that lawmen and townspeople alike struggled to comprehend. When authorities finally broke the lock and entered the sealed space, they found dust-choked beams, cobweb-laced rafters, and something far more disturbing than old furniture or forgotten trunks. Beneath a moth-eaten quilt laid an open chest, containing dozens of personal belongings, many of which matched descriptions of missing persons, each tagged with a name written in delicate cursive on yellowed slips of paper. But it wasn't the artifacts alone that unsettled the search party. It was the journal resting beside the chest, its pages filled with an ink that had faded only slightly, as if protected from time itself. The journal appeared to belong to Eliza Cunningham, its first entry dated just days after her parents perished in the fire. The handwriting was elegant and precise, almost too practiced. Each letter, a miniature sculpture of emotion held in restraint. Eliza wrote, not in diary form, but in something resembling ritual documentation. Her words were cold, clinical in detail, yet steeped in longing. She spoke of loneliness like it was an illness, something that seeped into the bones and never quite left. She described her sister Margaret as the only tether she had to sanity, and the inn as their sanctuary, one that needed to be preserved. It's purified and filled with warmth in order to protect them from the decay of the outside world. The journal contained records of guests who stayed at the inn, but not merely names and dates. Each entry cataloged the emotional state of the individual, their trauma, secrets, fears, and weaknesses. Eliza wrote of reading these feelings not through conversation, but through the scent of their breath, the color of their silence, and the weight of their steps at midnight, implying that she saw suffering not with her eyes, but with something deeper and more visceral. As the entries progressed, a chilling pattern emerged. Those who Eliza deemed irreparably broken were described with tender reverence. She wrote of offering them the final kindness, of relieving them of their burdens, of granting them peace. The language suggested a belief that she was not ending lives, but transforming them, offering a sort of spiritual release. Eliza referred to each death as a turning, comparing it to the blooming of a night flower or the melting of frost from a forgotten field. Margaret's involvement became clear in later entries, where Eliza detailed how her sister performed the washing and folding afterward, always humming the same lullaby their mother once sang during storms. It became evident that what had initially been a place of healing had gradually turned into a temple for a ritual born of grief, one that neither sister seemed able or willing to question. Some entries grew increasingly delusional. Lisa began to write as if the house itself were speaking to her, urging her to keep it warm, to feed its silence, to soothe its bones. She believed that every man who died there stayed within the walls, not as ghosts, but as memories that warmed the timbers, and whispered reassurance in the floorboards. She claimed that the inn remembered and that it thrived on kindness cloaked in mercy. There was no sign of remorse, only conviction. Each act was written with spiritual gravity, a sacred duty fulfilled by gentle hands and steady resolve. Her final entries suggested that she no longer saw herself as human in the traditional sense, but as a steward of the space, a guardian of the lost. She referred to herself not as Eliza, but as the keeper of rest. The attic journal was more than a confession, it was a psychological artifact, revealing a slow metamorphosis from grieving daughter to sanctified executioner. Investigators speculated that both sisters had created a shared delusion, a folly, adieu, in which their emotional void was filled by a fantasy of nurturing strangers to their eternal peace. Their victims, often vulnerable men, estranged from families, or worn down by the brutal world outside, became receptacles for the sisters' twisted version of compassion. Eliza's writings made it clear that she viewed death as a relief, a gesture of intimacy no one else could offer with such gentleness. She wrote that many of them wept in their final moments, not in fear, but in gratitude, though there was no way to verify this. Her words painted each death as a mercy-killing born, not of hatred, but of excessive empathy, channeled through a lens warped by isolation and trauma. Among the final pages of the journal, one entry stood out from the rest. It described a man who had resisted, a preacher from Georgia, weathered and quiet, who came to the inn with eyes that pierced through lies. Lisa wrote that he saw the cracks in their performance, questioned their generosity, and refused to drink the tea they offered. She detailed how this man's suspicion unsettled her, how Margaret had become nervous and clumsy, nearly dropping the tray she carried. Eliza wrote that for the first time, she felt fear not of exposure, but of judgment. Preacher's silence is holy fire, something that scorched the illusion they had spent years weaving. This man, she claimed, was the only guest they ever let go. He left at dawn, never speaking a word, and Eliza spent the following nights pacing the attic, certain that his presence had infected the house with doubt. That moment marked a subtle unraveling. The journal's tone shifted after that entry, less confident, more erratic. Elisa began to question if they had truly brought peace, or merely created a prison of silence. She described hearing unfamiliar creaks in the floorboards, rooms going cold even when the fire was roaring, and Margaret waking in the night whispering names they hadn't spoken aloud in months. The inn, once their haven, had turned on them. In the final page, Eliza wrote that love, when left unanchored by truth, became something ravenous. She asked a question that was never answered. If we offer peace with poisoned hands, is it still peace? The attic held no further answers, just that journal, those relics, and the thick air of secrets finally disturbed. The items were removed for evidence. Yet some officers reported strange sensations when handling the objects, sudden chills, whisper-like drafts, the unmistakable feeling of being observed. Whether it was imagination, guilt, or something else. Entirely, none of them would return to the attic again. The journal was eventually locked in the county archives, rarely spoken of but often read by curious scholars. It stood as a monument to two sisters whose desire to heal turned into a need to possess, and whose legacy would forever be etched, not in acts of kindness, but in the earth that hid their truths beneath wildflowers and soft southern lullabies.